Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, The Chemistry of Spices. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Peter Esco, Marketing Manager for SPEX CertiPrep, and I will be moderating the presentation today. Before we begin, I'd like to get a few housekeeping items out of the way. Everyone who registered for the webinar will get a copy of the presentation slides, and the webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel so that you can watch it again at your convenience. It'll be uploaded in the next week or so, and you'll receive a follow-up email with the link once it's available. If you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the question box on your screen, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce Patricia Atkins, our presenter for today's webinar. Patricia is our Products Application Specialist for SPEX CertiPrep and a regular from a number of past webinars and research projects, including our trace elements in children's toys and the chemistry of wine. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Patty.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome everyone this morning about our webinar of the chemistry of herbs and spices. This is going to be the basic chemistry and the background history of herbs and spices and a little bit about the research we've done. I know that some people I've met over the course of the past few months have already seen some of our research, and we will be getting into the real details of the heavy metals a little bit today, but we're going to wait for another webinar to really discuss all the scientific details and the processing of the spice samples. So we'll start out with what are herbs and spices. Spices are any aromatic vegetable product used to season or flavor foods, and these are usually the non-leaf components. Things like your roots, your flowers, your buds, the stems, and things like that. Herbs, on the other hand, are the leaf products. So we're going to start out with a little quiz. What do you think is the world's most popular spice? We'll give everyone a chance to answer the question. What is the most consumed spice in the world? And we'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, what does everybody think is the world's most consumed spice? Black pepper was 79%, followed by turmeric and then cinnamon. And everyone would be right. The most consumed spice in the world is black pepper, followed by cinnamon, cardamom, chili peppers, and cloves. Worldwide, we consume between 10 and 20 grams per person per day. India being at the top of that scope at around 14 to 20 grams per person per day. And there was a study done in Norway that showed about 3 grams per person per day of spices. Here in the U.S., we have a slightly different list of consumed spices. For some reason, we think salt is a spice here in the U.S., followed by black pepper, paprika, cinnamon, and chili peppers. In 2014, the U.S. consumed $3 billion worth of spices. When looking at the chemistry of spices, we can break it down into 3 areas. The areas of use. What are the active compounds that make cinnamon taste like cinnamon or rose oil smell like roses? What are those active compounds? Then you could also think about what contamination issues are brought about by production of spices. And finally, what might be done to a spice to adulterate it or counterfeit it, which would increase the value for the manufacturer or producer, but actually decreases the value for the consumer. First, we'll look at the active compounds, the compounds of use. Spice is often used as currency throughout history. We find it in beverages, teas, and tisanes, colorants. Medicines and supplements are very popular. Fragrances, and of course, the largest use of spices and herbs is for seasoning. Throughout history, there has been a long quest for expedition to find riches, including silk, gold, jewels, and spices. The Silk Road was established between Europe and the East. Marco Polo is famous for his journeys into China in search of goods. But around 1453, that's when the game changed in the world of exploration, especially in Europe. The Ottoman Empire actually took over Constantinople and blocked European spice access. So in 1453, the European royalty had no way of getting their spices, and they started to look for other routes, which fueled expeditions. You had Da Gama in 1497, rounding the Cape of Good Hope. And of course, here in the United States, we had Christopher Columbus sent by Spain looking for a Western trade route for spices. What he found, of course, was the Americas. By the 16 and 1700s, there were two main players when it comes to spices, the Dutch and the English. They both had their own companies for producing and selling spices. And one of the primary spices was actually nutmeg. Nutmeg was found in Indonesia primarily, and the Dutch had a pretty good monopoly on nutmeg in Indonesia, except for one island called the island of Run. That island was under great debate and hotly contested. And in 1664, the British actually took over the islands of Manhattan and Long Island. And later, in a treaty in 1667, the island of Manhattan and Long Island was traded for the island of Run. So Manhattan was actually traded for nutmeg. Historically, there was a lot of value in spices. They were only for the wealthy, for the rich. You would have them locked up in chests. They were commodities. And salaries and taxes could be paid in salt and spices. In fact, the Roman word for salary comes from the base of sel for salt. You could also pay your taxes in cumin seeds. Now, during the Middle Ages, a pound of peppercorns could buy the freedom of a serf. Or you could have a pound of nutmeg buy 7 fat oxen for your farm. Today, the economic value of spices is still pretty high. If you look at the value of some common commodities, copper, silver, and platinum, and then look at the value of some spices, you'd be surprised to find that $5 a pound will get you copper, but $10 a pound will get you gourmet salt, all the way up to $90 a pound for cardamom. Now, if you have a little bit more expensive taste, you could buy some silver at $240 a pound, or you could buy a pound of vanilla beans at $260. Now, if you are really wealthy, you could buy yourself a pound of saffron at almost $7,000, or you could buy yourself a pound of platinum for almost double that at $16,000. If we look at the properties of colorants for spices, color is mostly either a dye or a pigment. Dyes are soluble in water or other solvents, while pigments are not soluble in liquid matrices. When we think of color, we're thinking about visible light. The color in the spectrum of 400 to 700 nanometers, those are visible colors. So if you have a plant or a chemical that absorbs light between 400 and 435 nanometers, it's absorbing violet light. So the color then that will be displayed would be a yellow-green color. The chemistry of that particular ability to produce color is called a chromophore, and it's because it either contains a conjugated pi bond system, an alternating number of single and double bonds, like in an aromatic system, such as like the keratine, or it has a metal complex, like chlorophyll, which has magnesium. More often than not, there's also something called an oxychrome, which aids in the perception of color. These are functional groups which change the perception of a particular color. So you have carbonyls, carboxylic acids, amino groups, and hydroxyl groups. When we think about individual plants and the different chemistry of those plants, we will see that one of the predominant color of plants is, of course, chlorophyll, which is green. And these are compounds from the chlorin pigment. And again, it's that metal-magnesium complex that allows that color to be displayed. Another group of chemical plant dyes and pigments are anthracene. They're aromatics and they're conjugated. Things like naphthoquinones, which are red, a very famous color from St. John's wort, or anthraquinones, which are also red, and a very historically famous color was madder red, obtained from the madder root. Terpenes are very interesting because they actually cross many different boundaries, from fragrances and flavors to dyes. They are aromatics and conjugated. Something like a carotenoid would absorb light between 400 and 550 nanometers, and that will absorb the blues and the greens, which will then produce the yellow, orange, and red colors. Carotenes are orange and red. Particularly of interest is that saffron, that very expensive spice, which crocin is the actual compound that produces that orange color of the saffron. Xanthophylls will produce yellow colors, such as in marigolds. By far, though, the largest group of natural color compounds are the flavonoids. There are 15 carbon backbones with 2 phenyl groups and a heterocyclic ring, and they're usually in the pattern of C6, C3, C6, and they all contain a ketone group. There are 3 primary classes, the bioflavonoids, the isoflavonoids, and the neoflavonoids. And many of these compounds that I'm speaking about, these dye colors, are actually antioxidants. You'll also find out that antioxidants are very common in groups for medicines, groups for fragrances, and groups for flavors. Another very popular group of color, fragrance, and flavor compounds are the terpenes. It's become very popular over the last few years to talk about antioxidants in medical supplements, especially when it comes to things like the anthracyanids or the polyphenols, things like wine grapes and blueberries. That rich, deep blue color is considered to be a health benefit. So when we talk about medical uses, there's been historically a very long use of plants and herbs as medicine. And even now today, it's 80% of primary health care in countries of Asia and Africa. And in 2000 in India, the National Medicinal Plants Board was established. There was also a study done in 2010 which looked at 1,000 common plant-derived compounds, out of which they only found 156 published clinical trials for medical use. But it's been estimated that more than 25% of U.S. drugs have actually been derived from plants, things like opium, aspirin, digitalis. And why are so many medical uses found for spices and herbs? Because they have a lot of properties that make them very beneficial in medical use. They're antioxidants. Things like ginger and turmeric are touted for their antioxidant benefits, blueberries, wine. They're antimicrobials. Coconut oil has antimicrobial properties. They're specified for certain disease treatments. There's been a lot of investigation about cinnamon for diabetes. And of course, pain treatments have been in the news quite a bit over the last few years because we're talking about legal cannabis, medical cannabis, and its use for pain treatment and disease treatment. And of course, anybody who's used an athletic cream or a pain-reducing cream knows about capsaicin and mints. That brings us to combating pain with pain. The first compound we're going to talk about is capsaicin. And the reason why it is good in combating pain is because it acts directly on the nerve and causes an overstimulation reaction. When you experience pain, there's a substance called substance P, which is a neuropeptide. It's a neurotransmitter and a neuromodulator found in the sensory nerves in the brain and spinal column, and it's associated with an inflammatory pain response. By applying capsaicin to the body, it actually causes a depletion of substance P, reducing pain and limiting the action of the C nerve fibers. Now, C nerve fibers are responsible for throbbing pain. If you look on the other side, the cooling effect, you have menthol and camphor. This is a counter-irritant effect. It gives you a cool perception opposed to the heat of inflammation. And again, it's possible through the stimulation of other nerve fibers and blocking those throbbing C fibers. This type of sensation is called chemesthesis, and it's when chemical compounds activate other tissues other than your taste buds. So they create sensations of pain, touch, or thermal perceptions with the heat and the cold. For coolness, you're actually activating the trigeminal nerve sensors for cold. So you're turning your brain on to sense cold by the coolness of menthol or camphor. So these compounds activate ion channels on your nerve cells, and then you'll perceive that cooling mint or that herbal gel kind of feel. For the spicy flavors, you're acting also expressly on nerves, the TRPV1 and the TRPA1 receptors in particular, and this will produce pain. Pain in your mouth, your eyes, your membranes. That's why when you're cutting peppers or you're handling hot sauce, you're told to be very careful not to touch your eyes, your nose, and other tissues. But it's not a taste bud response. It's actually a pain response. And wherever you have a mucous membrane, that can act on the nerves there and cause pain. And primarily, these are capsaicin from your pepper products and your piperine from your black pepper. Now, a lot of us really are interested in hot peppers. And that heat comes from the capsaicin, but there's a bunch of other capsinoid compounds, and you can see the list here. But the primary one is the capsaicin, with about 16 million Scoville units, and it's about 70% of the heat compounds in a pepper. They're mostly found in the seeds and the membranes. Now, the pungency of chili peppers, how hot they are measured in Scoville units. And it was discovered or popularized by Wilbur Scoville, who was an American pharmacist, and he presented this in 1912. Many of us do not know what Scoville units mean, though, so I'm going to show you now what Scoville units mean. First, to determine a Scoville unit, they take an extraction of a dry pepper and put it into alcohol. They then dilute that extraction over multi-point dilutions in sugar water. Then they take an expert panel whose job it is to be hot pepper or hot sauce tasters. They have 5 of these expert panel members, and they are given them empirical testing. This means there's no data behind this. This is a sensory type of test. And they're given increasing concentrations of the hot pepper or the hot pepper sauce. When 3 of those 5 testers can actually taste heat, that is considered a positive test, and then the units are calculated on the dilution that they were given at that time. So you will have Scoville units in 100-unit levels. And the unit is called SHU, Scoville unit. Scoville units for some very popular peppers can be seen here in this chart. For banana peppers, they're pretty low. It's about 100. And then as you go up the line to something like a cayenne pepper, we're at 50,000. A habanero or a Scotch bonnet is 300,000. A ghost pepper is at 1 million. And the hottest pepper right now in the world is the Carolina Reaper at 2 million Scoville units. Just remember, though, pure capsaicin extract is 16 million Scoville units. And the pepper spray that police or the Army would carry, or even a very strong pepper spray, could be up to 5 million units. So here's time for another poll. What do you think about hot peppers and hot sauce? So how much hot sauce do you use? You never touch it? You have it once in a while, maybe sometimes. You use it really frequently, or like the commercial says, I put it on everything. We'll give everybody a minute or so to answer the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're closing the poll. So how much do we use? Most people said very frequently, or like the commercial says, I put it on everything. Some 19% saying sometimes, 19% saying once in a while, and 6% of you never touch it. So I would have to say most of us belong to the cult of the hot sauce. Of course, if you like hot pepper or hot sauce, you know there are stores totally dedicated just to selling hot sauce. There are web pages, fan pages. There are millions of websites that you can look at and videos on YouTube about the challenges of eating hotter and hotter hot sauce. Well, what happens is that hot sauce fans actually acclimate to that reaction that we spoke about, that pain reaction. And the more that they experience it, the more heat will take to actually activate that reaction. So the hot sauce junkies are looking for the hot all the time. There was a controversy in 2013 when the city of Irwindale in California sued to shut down the sriracha factory. There were people who started hoarding their favorite hot sauce, sriracha, in fear that it was going to be shut down for all time because of offensive odors. Well, everyone was happy to report that the odors were dealt with and the sauce was back on the market in 2014. Of course, the base of hot sauce is chili peppers, discovered in the Americas. The main producer today is India, so most of our chili peppers come from India. And there are 5 varieties of chili peppers. We have the bell and the cayenne, that's the Annam, the fructans, which is the Tabasco, and we have the Scotch bonnet and where the Carolina Reaper come in. And then the other 2 varieties I actually have no personal experience with, but the Rocoto and the Ahi. But what other ingredients could be in hot sauce? One of the things that we did look at during our spice study this year was hot sauce. We would look at red peppers and hot sauce, and we were looking primarily for heavy metals. I was very unhappy then to find heavy metals in my favorite hot sauces. So primarily it was lead at 21 parts per million. Now this was a packet. We had chain hot sauces, retail hot sauces, organic hot sauce. We had our fast food packet of hot sauce and our Chinese food packet of hot sauce. Now our Chinese food restaurant happens to be right around the corner from SPEX CertiPrep's offices. So it's a popular place for us to go to lunch, and they have this big box of these hot sauce packets right on the counter for you to take. And many of us would take a handful to go with our lunch and put them all over our food. So I decided to test it. The average use for this is about 1 to 2 packets, or about 20 grams. Unfortunately, my favorite Chinese food hot sauce packet had 21 parts per million of lead and 63 parts per million of chromium, which is about 30% my allowable daily limit for lead and chromium. What's even more sad is when I looked at the ingredients, the actual peppers themselves are pretty far down the list of ingredients. So you have water, food starch, then your cayenne pepper, vinegar, spices, colorings, and preservatives. So the fact that there's that much lead and so little actual pepper is a little bit concerning. Some of the other flavor compounds that are very popular in spices, or that we find in great quantities in spices, are carbohydrates, which are your sugars, your glucose, your ethyl-maltitol. Those give you those cotton candy sugar tastes. Carbonyls, from ketones to carboxylic acid. Mostly those give you berry types taste, bitter almond, raspberry, wintergreen, apple, things like that. You have your organic acids and your organic acid salts, like ethyl decanate, which is a pear flavor. Your ionic salts, which of course are your sodium chloride, that gives you that salty flavor. Proteins and amino acids, like monosodium glutamate, which we all know as MSG, that gives us that umami, that mouthfeel. And then your terpenes, like a monoterpene, like myrcene. So if you like hops, or if you're a fan of cannabis, that earthy kind of taste that you get from hops in your beer is from the terpene myrcene. Most of the common flavor compounds are esters. And it should be interesting to note that the raspberry ketone, if you go to buy the flavoring for raspberry ketone, the extract, it's actually the most expensive natural flavorant in the world at $9,000 to $10,000 a pound. Now, how you perceive those tastes depends on what portion of your tongue your taste buds are tasting the different flavors. If you're tasting sweet, it's primarily at the front of your mouth, and it's from your proteins, the carbohydrates, and the carbonyls, and it's a G protein receptor in your taste buds. If you're tasting salty, it's in that blue area, again, near the front of the tongue, and those are ion channels tasting the alkali metals like sodium, potassium, iron. If you're tasting sour, it's mostly from acids on the side of your tongue, again, from ion channels. If you're tasting bitter, things like capsicums and phenols, you're tasting because of your type 2 taste receptors in the back of your mouth. And that umami, that mouthfeel, is from your amino acids, your nucleotides, especially things like caffeine, and that's because the variants of the G protein receptors in your taste buds are down the center of your mouth there. Speaking about the perception of taste, it's time for another quiz or another poll. What does cilantro taste like to you? Is it fresh and earthy, just like a normal herb? Does it taste like soap and it's completely inedible? Does it taste like a lemon, an herb with a little sour twist? Or do you think it doesn't taste like any of these? Go ahead and vote now. We'll be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, what does cilantro taste like? Oh, we have quite a bit of cilantro lovers here. Fresh and earthy, just like a normal herb. Only 18% of the crowd actually thinks it tastes like soap is inedible. Or, yes, it tastes like lemon with a little bit of a twist, and 6% said none of these. So, if you don't like cilantro, let's tell you why. Cilantro is actually the leaves, and the seeds are called coriander, and you'll find them in many cuisines like Mexican cuisine, Middle Eastern cuisine. The debate often focuses around the aroma and the taste of the cilantro. Is it a lemon, lime, citrus, or is it soap and bugs? Well, there was a survey from the University of Toronto, and they asked their respondents what countries of origin or what background were they, and whether or not the cilantro tasted like soap. 21% of Eastern descent said soap it is. 17% of European descent said also it's soap. So for the most part, our polls are kind of in line. About 17–18% overall of people believe that it tastes like soap. The group that loved cilantro the most was of Middle Eastern descent, where 97% said they loved the taste of cilantro, and 3% of them said it tasted like soap. Well, there's actually a good reason why cilantro tastes like soap. The primary compounds, or the active compounds in cilantro, are aldehydes. And there are a lot of components, or a lot of aldehyde components that are part of soaps and bug sprays. There is an odorant aldehyde that actually is part of soaps and bug sprays. Primarily for cilantro, though, it's 3 aldehydes, especially the decenol. And there is some suggestion that if you crush the cilantro and you let the compound start to oxidize, that those aldehydes will convert into more pleasant scents, giving you a more pleasant taste. In 2012, though, those of us who do not like cilantro and always said that there had to be something genetic about it, well, it was found that there is a genetic component to not liking cilantro. There are certain receptors that cannot process aldehydes. So they're not able to take those unsaturated aldehydes and make them into a form that's more pleasant. What was surprising was these were not in the taste buds. These receptors were in your olfactory system. And it kind of makes sense because 80% of what you taste has a contribution of odor. So if you ever think about it, whenever you have a very bad cold or you can't smell, the food doesn't taste as good because there is a significant component of fragrance to the ability to taste. So that leads us to the compounds of fragrance that we find in spices. Your olfactory system is a chemoreception system. So your odorants, the chemicals, enter your nasal passages. The mucus acts like a solvent matrix for those odorant chemicals. They diffuse through the mucus and then activate your olfactory receptors. What's interesting to note, though, is that the olfactory system is actually the only sensory system directly connected to the human forebrain. All the rest of the sensory systems actually have to go through the processing centers of your brain before they are perceived, but smell is the only scent, or is the only system that goes directly to the human forebrain. And most of the natural fragrance chemicals come from the flowers. They are usually volatile chemicals, less than 300 mass units, and most VOCs come from plants. You will often see some scientific literature talking about natural air pollution. What they're usually talking about is VOC pollution, or the off-gassing of plants. Famously, this is seen as the Smoky Mountains or the Blue Mountains, where the haze hangs over the mountains, and this is all the off-gassing of the pine trees and other trees. Mostly these are isoprene units, terpenes, terpenoids, and terpenols. Terpenes are very important in fragrances. Most of the fragrances that we consider to be characteristic of a certain product or a certain smell are actually terpenes or terpenoids. Things like pinene from pine and rosemary. Linalool gives you the mints and the lavenders. Limonene for the citrus and the lemon. If you drink beer, it's humulene from hops. If you like a good glass of wine or like a nice scented rose, it's geraniol. And like we said before, if you like a little bit of the medicinal cannabis, you're talking about the myrcene. The next group of chemicals we'll talk about when it comes to spices comes from contamination, mostly through production. If you look at the areas of the world where spices are grown, 76% of spices are grown in India, with smaller amounts in China, Turkey, Bangladesh, and other countries. Some regions of the world of sanitation issues, and this has been brought to light within the last few months because the recall of Mexican cilantro due to sanitation issues, which has exposed people to salmonella poisoning. Are we being given a lesser quality product or part? So are you being given to the stem of a plant when the root is actually the spice that you want? Is it being stored appropriately? Are any contaminants being added like sand or dirt or fill? If we look at the spice processing, there are many places where errors can happen or contamination can happen. Receiving and stockpiling would be the first place. Is there any QC or an inspection done? So when a processor receives materials from a grower, from a harvester, are they actually getting what they think they're getting? Or are they being substituted with something? So is there a QC process, some identification process? Is there a quality process? Are any hazards discussed or identified? How are those stockpiles stored? Are they stored over the course of years until there's enough to make a stored area where climate should be of control, or is in a location where there might be pests or rodents or other contaminants that might be introduced? I did watch some videos of spice processing recently where the spice processors talked about fumigating their raw materials because of pests, because of mice and rodents. So are those fumigate materials actually legal, or are they able to be used within spice products? Then you have your initial processing. Do they do any sorting? Is it mechanical? Is it physical? Is there any cleaning involved? If there is a cleaning, like if they fumigate their product for pests and they use some sort of chemical or water for cleaning, are those chemicals cleared from the actual spices before they're processed, or do you have to look for residual solvents? Is there any drying involved? Is it kiln dried or air dried? How are those spices processed? Are they roasted? There are a lot of volatile compounds in spices. Many of these compounds have boiling points, melting points, or volatile points under 250 degrees Celsius. Well, a lot of roasters can go easily to 250 degrees or higher. Some gas roasters up to 4,000 degrees Celsius. How the spice processed with grinding? Is there a dedicated use grinder? Now, there was a poster given not too long ago at a show I was at, which talked about the cross-contamination of nut allergens in spices. So if there's not a dedicated use grinder, you could be cross-contaminating with nuts, other spices, or whatever that grinder was used for last. And if any cleaning was involved, are we going to see cleaning solvents? There's also the question of the age of the equipment. The older the equipment, the better the chance there being wear metals or heavy metals being contaminating the spices from the actual equipment. And then your final processing and packaging. Are they being blended with unreported ingredients? Is there any final QC being done? And how is the package and storage conditions or the storage time going to affect that product? Is there going to be issues of contamination? Potential contamination can take the form of microorganisms like viruses and bacteria. 7% of spice products are contaminated by salmonella, according to the FDA. And spices are twice as likely as any other food good to be contaminated with salmonella. Out of all the shipments that were done over 3 years, 750 shipments were refused. And we have an example, like I said, within the last few weeks of cilantro from Mexico because of salmonella. There's also issues of mold. Improper storage, improper moisture content can actually increase mold content. Then you have filth, which is your insects, your dirt, and etc. 12% of imported spices actually do contain high levels of filth, and 238 shipments were refused over the course of 3 years. Then you have your cross-contaminations, your other spices, your food products, or your nuts. Some potential chemical contamination can take the form of pesticides, illegal pesticides, or non-permitted levels of legal pesticides. You have your solvents from manufacturing or cleaning residue. You have metals like heavy metals or wear metals from processes or contamination, bulking, flow agents, or preservatives. These could be unapproved additives, things that were never approved, especially by the FDA in this country, for use in foods. Or you could have approved additives, things that are generally recognized as safe, GRAS. But these additives are either not reported or underreported, things like sodium chloride or silica. So how do you know if it's contamination, adulteration? Is it an additive? Is it a nutrient? Well, mostly the toxic metals are all about concentration. Arsenic, cadmium, mercury, those are clearly toxic metals, and the higher the concentration, the more of concern of safety. Things like lead, chromium, manganese, and zinc, They are considered to be toxic metals, but they also could be wear metals, they could be additives, they could be nutrients. And again, it's about concentration and reporting. Wear metals are things like chromium, copper, aluminum, iron. Nutrients, of course, are things that are reported in databases like the USDA nutrient database. There are things like copper and iron, calcium, and you see there's a lot of overlap. So how do we know if our spices have been adulterated, if they have excess additives, nutrients, or whatever? Well, you look, do the spices fall within a normal distribution for a spice product? This year, our projects have mostly been upon the heavy metals and the metal content of our spices and our phytomedicines. We looked at them by ICP and ICP-MS, and they were very well received at several conferences this year. For us, we had 8 groups of spices and spice products, things including teas, sauces, condiments, everything from black pepper to salt. We had whole and ground spices, and they ranged in price from dollar store all the way up to name brand and organic. Our sample prep was pretty straightforward. For our solid spices, we used our SPEX sample prep freezer mill, and we ground them. We digested all of our samples using microwave digestion. We, of course, used our ICP-MS standards, and we did our analysis ICP-OES and ICP-MS. Our ICP-OES gave us our wear metals and our macro elements, and the ICP-MS was able to give us our toxic elements. So how did we determine what was what? How did we determine the contamination or the nutrient or the additive? Well, first we looked, were there any toxic metals and at what levels? Were there any large amounts of additive metals or wear metals that were not reported, or were they underreported? And did we see any patterns that suggested adulteration? I'm going to give you an example now of our chili powder samples. Here we have 7 chili powder samples. We have some dollar store samples. We have a chain store. A chain is like Walmart or Target brand. We have a retail, which is if you go into a supermarket, there are retail brands of spices, one of those. And then we had an organic brand that we ordered online. We did find toxic metals. We found 1.2 ppm of cadmium in our dollar store. In that same dollar store, we saw 0.4 ppm of arsenic. We saw 7.1 ppm of total chromium. And unfortunately, we did find almost 2 ppm of lead, and that was unfortunately in our organic sample. What was disturbing, though, was the large amounts of additive metals that were not reported or underreported. So out of all of these samples, the chain and the retail brands actually admitted to adding salt to the mix. So our chain B, retail and organic, claimed salt, and they had between 1.2 and 3.8% of sodium in those mixes. The dollar store samples did not report any salt, but you can see that it ranged from 11 to 13% salt. Now it's time for a poll about heavy metals and spices. In our study, what do you think was the heavy metal that had the highest concentration and was found in the most number of spices? So what do you think was the bad boy of our bad boy list? All right, we're going to end it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So what did we find the most of? What do you think we found the most of? 70% of you said lead, 14 arsenic, 14 cadmium, and 3% mercury. Well, we have a very, very smart audience because what we did find the most of was lead. We found up to 3 ppm of lead in our cinnamon and our turmeric. We found lead in 2.2 ppm in our red pepper. So there was a lot of lead. And I purposely took chromium out of the question and out of this graph because we did not speciate for chrome 6. We did total chrome. So there was actually quite a bit of chrome in these samples as well. But not being able to speciate it, I didn't want to include it in with the heavy metals here. So why would we see all of these heavy metals? Why would we see excess sodium? Why would we see these additives that are not reported? It comes down to money. Adulteration means value, at least value for the manufacturer and producer, not necessarily for the consumer. The 5 most counterfeited foods that are documented here in the U.S. are olive oil, honey, milk, juices, and spices. And why would they do that? You would think milk and juice are pretty cheap, so why would they adulterate it? Well, olive oil costs $215 wholesale per 100 pounds. The most common adulterant for olive oil is something like a canola oil, and canola oil is $25 per 100 pounds. For honey, it's $175 for 100 pounds. For corn syrup, $75 per 100 pounds. Milk, they'll adulterate with urea and water, and it costs them $13 per 100 pounds, whereas real milk costs them about $100 per 100 pounds. And orange juice, $130 per 100 pounds, where corn syrup is half that at $75. There was a sampling of spices in New York, and they found that 70 to 80% of the spices coming in through New York were adulterated and contaminated in some way. Now, the FDA defines food adulteration as substances at sufficient quantity to do harm. That would cover things like pesticides or heavy metals, or the absence, substitution, or addition of constituents. So when a valuable constituent is either total or partially substituted, or you're given a damaged or inferior product. Now, some people are like, well, what's a damaged inferior product? If you think of a particular spice, we'll take garlic as an example. The garlic plant itself has stems, it has leaves, it has flowers, it has roots, it has the outer covering, and then it actually has the bulb that we consider to be garlic. Well, the stems, the covering, the leaves, the flowers, all of that other material is not considered what we would think to be as garlic. It's an inferior product. But if they grind that up, they call it garlic. So that would be a damaged or inferior product. Or a product that's been sitting and has grown mold. So now it is damaged, and they're still selling it, so then that is a damaged product. There's also the additions, which will increase the weight of a product, reduce its strength, or reduce its quality. These are all intentional adulterations. The most common intentional adulterations for spices are things like sawdust or bran powder, silica or sand, starch or flour, salts like sodium chloride, chalk or talcum powder, charcoal. It's interesting with charcoal. There is an adulterant or a counterfeit for cumin seeds, where you take grass seeds and you color them with charcoal. So you make them look like cumin seeds, but yet they're actually grass seeds. Brick powder is often substituted for things like chili powder or cumin powder. Then you have your illegal dyes, things like your lead chromate dyes, your azo dyes, methanol yellow. These are meant to take a product that maybe's lost some of its color that would be natural to that spice and basically dye it back to make it look more appealing or more like the spice they're trying to pass for. Then there are illegal preservatives, preservatives that are not approved. Maybe they have an old product and they want to make sure that it can last in the warehouses or in their processing facility for a year or more, so they'll add illegal preservatives. Or illegal pesticides, either illegal amount of pesticides or a totally illegal pesticide. So how do we find out if a sample is adulterated or counterfeited? Well, you can build a spice profile. For that, you need reliable sources of valid data for real products, which can be very difficult to come by. Here in the United States, the USDA actually does provide spice profiles or food profiles. If you go to their National Nutrition Database, they will give you what a typical spice or food product would look like in terms of all of the nutritional information. And sometimes they actually have a lot of statistics that go along with it. This one happens to be for caraway seed. You can also do journal searches for marker compounds. So there are things like the capsaicin, which are indicative to hot peppers. So that could be an organic marker compound if you're trying to test the validity or the actual product to see if it's counterfeit or not. Then you examine your chemical data for your targets. Do you see heavy metals? Do you see wear metals? Do you see unreported additives? And you compare your data against your profiles. Are there any patterns that suggest adulteration or counterfeiting? Does the data suggest there's contamination there? So I'm going to show you two spice profiles that we have built for black pepper and cinnamon. Black pepper is the king of spices. It is 20% of the spice market. and it's the unripened cooked fruit of the flowering vine, Piper nigrum. And the fruit is called the peppercorn. The largest producers of black pepper in the world are Vietnam and India, and they're harvested from May to August, and each vine will yield about 10 kilograms of peppercorns a season. It takes 12 years for a vine to mature enough to actually produce a harvest. There are technically 3 colors of black peppers, but we know 4. There's, peppercorns. Black pepper, which is 75% of the peppercorn sold. White peppercorn, which is 25% of the peppercorn sold. Now, some people think white peppercorns are actually different than black peppercorns. It is the same peppercorn. What happens is they take those peppercorns and they soak them in running water like a stream to rot over the course of several weeks. That outer layer rots off and separates, and you're left with the white layer underneath. And you also have your green peppercorns, which are pickled usually, and they're a specialty food item. And we have red, pink. These are not actually from the Piper nigrum plant. They're from a different species altogether. So the active compounds that you could build a profile around, the organic compounds for your flavor is piperazine. It's 5 to 10% by mass, and it is the outside layer of the plant. So that blackened layer or that green layer is where that piperine compound comes from. So if you're going to have a white peppercorn, you actually have lost that outer layer. Now that compound actually is very reactive to light and will change very quickly. That's why they say you shouldn't really buy ground pepper that's more than a few weeks or a few months old, because it very quickly loses that flavor compound. Now, if you've ever tasted real black pepper, freshly ground, and then tried, what most Americans grow up with as black pepper, the stuff that sits in the shaker for years, there is a very big difference. There's a different quality to the taste, there's a different quality to the smell, and that's mostly because these volatile compounds very quickly change to other things or volatilized off the pepper. So you're better off getting a whole peppercorn in order to get that fruity fragrance and flavor. Now, the peppercorn, if it's being ground, you have to be concerned about what temperatures it's being ground at or roasted at, because the melting point for the piperine is 130 degrees C. The scent compounds for pepper, which makes it that spicy floral scent, is carophyllene and pinene, and they're both terpenes. When we looked for contamination and additives, we found lead and chromium, mostly in our dollar store brands at about 1.2 ppm. So we did find some lead contamination. We used the USDA database for black pepper, and they did have quite a few data points. They were able to give us some statistics, and from those statistics we calculated 3 standard deviations, and we were able to build a profile for black pepper. What would be a normal distribution for black pepper? Now, there were 2 elements that we were interested in, the silica and aluminum. We could not find USDA data for, but we did find references in the literature for silica being at 20 micrograms per gram in seeds and between 100 and 200 micrograms per gram for fruit and grains. For aluminum, we found references for teas at 100 micrograms per gram, and for a baking mix where aluminum is added, about 800 micrograms per gram. When we took our data and compared it to the USDA, one product clearly fell out of distribution, that dollar ground E. The darker the purple compound, the farther away from 3 standard deviations. So if it was purple, it fell outside 3 standard deviations. And you can see our dollar ground E for every single compound fell out of 3 standard deviations. We also had magnesium and aluminum and silica fall out of 3 standard deviations for what normal black pepper should look like. In particular, what we found was that there were toxic metals, of course, the lead, and we saw large amounts of additive metals that were not reported or underreported. If we look at the retail whole black pepper, that's the very last black pepper, you can see that the silica level for whole black pepper from a reliable retailer was 300 micrograms per gram. But in our dollar store ground E, and something like our farmer's ground, it was close to 1,000 micrograms per gram, if not over 1,000 micrograms per gram. So clearly silica was added to this. When we looked at the sodium levels, the sodium level for most of our reliable black peppers was the 100, 150, 200 range. but the dollar ground E was closer to 300, as well as the farmer's ground closer to 300 micrograms per gram. We also found patterns that suggested adulteration. It was the dollar store brands that we saw the high metals in. It was the dollar store brands that fell out of distribution. So our cheap spices were the ones that tended to be out of range. And we happened to read about a solvent test to test for the counterfeiting of black pepper. A popular process for counterfeiting black pepper, especially whole black pepper, is to take papaya seeds and dry them. They look very, very similar to black pepper, whole black pepper, and then you could substitute out all or part of the whole black pepper for these dried papaya seeds. The dried papaya seeds, however, will float in a solvent, where real black pepper seeds will actually fall to the bottom. So hearing about this little experiment, we decided that we would try it on our two whole black pepper samples, our whole dollar store and our whole retail. Our whole retail is on the left. It fell to the bottom, but our whole dollar store floated to the top. So we did have what we believe to be a counterfeited whole black pepper. Our second profile is cinnamon. For cinnamon, you're actually consuming the inner layer of the bark, and the largest producers in the world are Indonesia and China. And there are many varieties. They're all based on different sizes, bark thicknesses. They have slightly different flavors and fragrances. What we think of as cinnamon for most of us is acacia. It's the most common. It's also called the Chinese cinnamon. There are other types of cinnamon that are more expensive, the Vietnamese cinnamon and things like that. Cinnamon is a tree that's grown for 2 years, and then it's cut down to ground level. That will force the tree to send up much thinner shoots, and then those are cut into quills and graded by size. For our samples, we looked at 7 spice samples. They range between $1 and $29 for 100 grams. We had an organic sample, 2 whole samples of cinnamon, and different cinnamon products, a cinnamon tea, which was a mix of 3 cinnamons, and a supplement, which was the Lorelei cinnamon. When we built our profile, the flavor and fragrance compound marker would be cinnamaldehyde, and it's up to 1% for the mass of the bark, and it's in the essential oil. 90% of that essential oil is the compound cinnamaldehyde, and it has a boiling point of 248 degrees C. So if it's being roasted or dried in any way in a kiln, it could be driving off some of this volatile compound. When we looked for our heavy metals, we did find all of our heavy metals in our cinnamon compound. And the worst offenders for all of the metals were the cheaper brands, with the exception of, unfortunately, our organic brand, again, seemed to have some lead at almost 3 ppm. We did see mercury in our 3 cheaper brands, the $E, the $5, and the Farmers. We found cadmium at 0.6 or 0.9% of the allowable daily allowance. So there was quite a bit of metals in our cinnamon. Again, we went to the USDA and we found our cinnamon distribution. We found all of our different nutrient metals, and we calculated our 3 standard deviations. For this, we had several products that seemed to be questionable. Our supplements and our tea did fall out of distribution. Now, this might be because they are products and not quote-unquote spices, or it might be that something has been done to those supplements and teas that do not characterize them as cinnamon anymore. Our dollar store E clearly fell out of distribution, and then there were some wear metals or some other compounds that were questionable. What is very surprising, though, is things like our silica. On our supplement, silica was not listed on the supplement's ingredients list, but we found it 10 times higher than some of our other samples. Our retail sample at 100 micrograms per gram, and here the supplement was 10 times that amount at over 1,000 micrograms per gram. Also surprising, the tea, which is considered to be a supplement or food product, had sodium in it that was not reported on the label. If you look at the sodium for a retail, you're looking at between 50 and maybe 150 micrograms per gram, but for the supplement, it's over 200, and for the tea, it's over 600 micrograms per gram. So did we find any toxic metals for our cinnamon? Yes. Were there large amounts of additive metals not reported or underreported? Yes, especially the products were not in range, and some of our cheaper spices were out of range. So what does that mean? That means there is an obvious cost when it came to the heavy metals. The cheaper samples, the dollar store samples, were more than 50% of the samples with high metals, particularly our dollar SI brand. So this one brand did come up over and over again, or our dollar E at 31 and 23% of the highest heavy metals that we found. Most of our cheaper samples were about 77% of all of the high levels, including our dollars and our chain stores. And it does show that there's economic motivation for adulterating or allowing increasing contamination into these samples. Just to give you a little summary of some of our spice findings, did we find toxic metals? Yes, mostly lead, then cadmium, some arsenic, a lot of chromium, but it was total chrome and not designated as chrome 6 or isolated as chrome 6. Some of the levels, especially in the hot sauce, were of levels of concern. Were there large amounts of underreported or non-reported wear metals or additives? Yes, mostly sodium, silica, magnesium, and iron. Were there patterns of adulteration? Yes, there were some suspicious colors and consistencies of some spices. Some of the black pepper spices, especially the one that fell out of distribution, had a very uniform gray color. It did not actually look like black pepper. It looked more like charcoal. It didn't have the characteristic flecks that you would expect in black pepper. Some of our spice mixes, our chili mixes and chili powder mixes, had odd colors to them, very unrealistic looking colors and consistencies. There were also products and spices that did not fall with what would be considered a normal distribution with our USDA range, especially in the cheaper brands of spices, the dollar brands. And there were some clearly counterfeited or adulterated spices. I am just wrapping it up for today, but I hope you've enjoyed our webinar. And if you want to know more, specifically if you want to know about the experiment that we did, we are going to go into more detail in a second upcoming webinar where we will discuss our sample preparation, our dilutions, and all of the spices that we actually found heavy metals in. And we'll go into much more detail in an upcoming webinar. But I hope you've enjoyed this first webinar in our spice series.